Welcome to a new edition of If I Ever Live to Be. Today, I'm joined by Todd Kemp. He is owner of FPC Marietta, which is an executive search consultant firm specializing in the aerospace and defense industry. Todd, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. You and I were introduced via good friends of personally me and this podcast, because I reference them quite a lot, but Matt and Buffy Payne.
Yep.
I've heard you speak before, and I'm telling you, Todd, I'm going to be a very lazy host on this episode because I feel like I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you talk, and I'm going to be quiet. So, Todd, I want to talk about your career journey because I feel like that's really going to set us up nicely, and then it's just going to flow from there. So, right now, in current time, you are the owner of FPC Marietta. So, I'd love to hear like how you went from there, but you were one of our first responders. You were a paramedic, and you also served our wonderful country in the United States Air Force. So we thank you for that. I just love to hear you kind of share a little bit about your journey.
So, long story short, I wound up going into business for myself after a very brief stint doing a very quick sales job, and then realizing, well, I can work with corporate America. I probably can't work for them. And a lot of that would stem just because of the military-ish background between having worked in EMS as a first responder and, of course, 23 years in the United States Air Force. So, 23 years, Air Force, did all kinds of cool stuff. Started off doing, crypto, code breaking, wound up working in the command post, battle staff, working in the war room, big operations, transferred over into, base ops, airfield flight management type stuff, flight tracking aircraft, managing and maintaining the airfield. Deployed to Iraq doing intel, surveillance, and reconnaissance on a very weird, kind of crazy mission that wasn't technically what I was trained to do, but yet based upon previous experience, they took a whole lot of us and combined us into this very unique mission, providing intel, surveillance, and recon at, the different kind of level over in Iraq. And then, of course, I hit the pinnacle, got lucky enough to be promoted to a chief master sergeant, and was working at the headquarters head shed. And after that, it was like, all right, enough. I'm going to retire, find something else to do. So I wound up becoming a paramedic, did that for 9 years, and then realized, as I hit my 50s and the fountain of middle age, I getting a little bit too old to be doing jujitsu in the back of an ambulance and, wrestling naked psych patients covered in feces. So it was time to find something new and more stable. So I did a quick little sales job, but realized it just wasn't for me, and that I would be better off going into business for myself. So did a lot of research, looked at options, felt like going into a franchise was an option. And this one, as far as recruiting, it kind of gave me the continued sense of purpose, because part of what I do is relying on my aerospace and defense expertise from the Air Force. Obviously, I'm looking to help companies fill their hard to fill in talent positions using a very, call it a broad and diverse candidate pool, but basically being my fellow brothers and sister veterans that at the same time they're transitioning out of the military, helping them find that new sense of purpose and basically, get over their identity crisis. Because I don't care who you are. When you're in the military, whether it was for 4 years, up to 30 years, you have an identity crisis. You kind of lose that sense of purpose. So going into being an executive recruiter allows me to kind of help, kill two birds with one stone. It helps me help companies fill their talent acquisition voids with top-rated talent. And at the same time, it helps me help our transitioning brother and sisters getting out find stable employment in the system as they're kind of, rediscovering themselves as they become a civilian and figure out what their new chapter in our life's going to be. So that's kind of how I got from there to where I am today.
Yeah. Well, this whole section right here is probably the most Whitney's going to talk the whole entire podcast, because I just really want to turn it over to you, Todd, and you share with us what you're comfortable with of your journey. But I will preface it and kind of tee it up with how you made me feel the first two times that we spoke. So the first time when I just dialed into this call, and it was like an invite only presentation at the end of the year where we all jumped on teams together and you just shared your story. And then I was like, wow, I so want to have Todd on my podcast. And you and I had like a preliminary call just to get to go know each other a little bit better. And the two things I will tell you that I've picked up already is one, your whole entire life. I don't know if you see this or not, but your whole entire life has been dedicated to helping others. Everything that I see and have heard about you just in our limited conversations, you're all about helping others. Um, but there was a time in your life where you feel like you couldn't help yourself. And so I definitely want us to get into that. And I will also tell you how you made me feel, because I remember we were talking about my grandfather was in the Air Force. And so that really fosters, just on a personal level, my love of country and fellow man and woman who serve in any of our branches of armed forces. But I often say that I would never be strong enough to do that. I think I'm a strong person. I don't know that I'd be strong enough, like, to make it through basic training. I think that they would tell me this is not for everyone and you need to go home, like, and with other colorful words. But I think that they would send me home. I just don't really know that I would be strong enough to make it through and face all that you do. And I was telling you my story and some things I've experienced in my life of, divorce and loss of a parent at 30. And I just felt like both of those things were so small compared to what you had done with your life. And you really made me feel like, no, it's not. Those are still hard things to go through. And so even though our hards are different, they're still very hard. And I really appreciated that. And I have tried to consciously change the way that I speak about my circumstances and not to belittle them, really trying to not belittle my own self and my own experiences. And so I just wanted to share how appreciative I am with that, because you're continuing to help others, even though maybe you don't see it.
Well, I appreciate that. And that kind of is my intent, is just, it's all about helping others. You read the good book and, we got two major commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the whole point is to help take care of others when you can. Finding the balance to be able to do that, where I was taking care of myself and take care of others, well, that's something I have never been good at. And to be honest, I've done myself more harm and damage over the years by sacrificing so much, to the point that, to be honest, I have to question, was I really helping others in the best way possible when I was literally at my wits' end and had nothing left to offer? So there is a balance. And not to sound hypocritical, but I'm guilty of doing the same thing. So, part of my story, you heard about, who I supported in the military and stuff, but I was just a regular Air Force guy. A lot of people get on there and try and, talk about their levels of service. And there are people that serve in the military, what we call the tip of the spear. They're the ones at the very hardcore front lines, whether you're with special operations, the Navy SEALs, Delta, Matt being part of the combat controllers, the Air Force side of the house, whether you're Marine recons, whatever, whether you're just, standard infantry, Army, or everything else. I don't want to say just, because when you're still in harm's way, that seems big. And it really, really is. And they don't get enough credit for what they do. But even for the little bit that I did in my tour, was I in some danger? Yes. Did I provide support to those guys? Yes. But do I consider what I was doing in support as big or as dangerous as important to them? Absolutely not. And part of, me wrestling with some of the demons I did is how am I justified feeling the way I felt when I was going through that dark period? Because I'm an Air Force guy, I'm in the, for what most of the regular wartime guys would call me, I would have been what they call a pogue, which is a post-only grunt. Means you may have been in the zone, but you weren't outside the wire. Although I did go outside the wire a couple of times. I was not out like constantly like those guys were. So what little bit I went through, it still has that impact for you. And it gets back to the whole point of the premise here is it's about perception. You hear you've got reality and you've got perception of reality. And the perception is 9/10 of the law. And we have to remember that there are certain things that you could see and go through, and it may be not a big deal. To somebody else, it could be detrimental and devastating and just absolutely scare them. I know people who've been in minor fender bender car accidents, didn't think anything of it. And then I know people who barely get the nudge from the back end, and then they're terrified to go get into a car because it was so horrific for them. So everybody's experiences are unique and they're personal to them. And what may be, terrifying, scary, or traumatic for one person, it may not be for the other. But that doesn't mean just because it's not scary or traumatic for this person here, that the value of this person over here that it was scary for holds any less value. And we need to remember that as we're dealing with people who have mental health issues and struggles that are battling those demons, we still need to show that compassion and empathy and support, even if we look at a situation and say, well, it wouldn't have bothered me that way. But you also never know what that person's previously been through that may or may not make what would be a smaller incident bigger. So it gets back to, we have to show that kindness and compassion to everybody, regardless of whether you are, a frontline, hardcore, multiple tours, bullets flying, bombs blowing up, whatever, or, whether you're support guy in the rear with the gear, for the most part, safe and sound. But what impacts one person doesn't necessarily impact the other, but it doesn't lessen the value either way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would love, because you share of patience and having that heart and helping others. And I would love for you to share how you found that in your faith journey, because I would wager it can be hard to find God and see where he's at in some of the things that you have seen and dealt with.
Well, it's kind of one of the funny things there when you find God, because ultimately God wants us to have faith in him and trust with him and have that relationship and be with him in the process. One of the greatest things of love that he gave us, next to salvation through Jesus, is the fact that he's given us freedom, the ability to choose when, where, how we're going to interact with him. And he'll even let it get to the point to where you think you've got it. He's going to let you handle it. But to be honest, I think many of us go through a lot of pains and journeys in life that we're not meant to go through. We were supposed to turn it over to God a long time ago, but trying to be independent and someone who's very strong, stubborn, and bullheaded.
Same.
Nope, I got it. I'm got it. And he's like, okay. And you get to that point to where you keep going and you keep going and you keep going. He'll eventually let you hit your breaking point. And ultimately, that's kind of what happened with me. I'm in hindsight, when I look back to everything I went through up to the point where I did hit my breaking point, and I did get to the point where I was attempting to take my life when God finally intervened. I was trying to handle it all because I didn't want to be considered as weak. I didn't, I had the same kind of thing as you is how can I feel justified to feel this way? Because I'm not that important. My tour wasn't that special. It wasn't as hardcore. Was there danger? Yes. Did I almost die in a couple of mortar attacks, which were usually more nuisance than anything else? Yes. Was there traumatic events being involved with loss of life, and you kind of watch people die and realize I was a part of that, and you question yourself in human life? Yeah. You go through a lot of that. Part of the biggest thing that I hated was the fact that, in spite of the close calls, I made it home from Iraq. And a few years later, one of my troops who would have gotten out of the Air Force and joined the Army became a combat medic. He wound up on his first tour at the ripe young age of 23, getting killed in action in Kandahar, and left behind a 6-month-old daughter that would never know her father. And those are the things that come back to haunt you later. And again, all of this will compile and build up that you're like, I'm not that special. I'm not that big, but why am I so special that I got to live and he didn't? And then the survivor's guilt creeps in, and then you start having all of those things weigh you down so heavy to the point you do hit your breaking point. And it's ultimately where I got to that point. You were asking about the part of where I would get to really trusting and knowing God. It was at my breaking point when I was at my wit's end, and in the darkest time of my life, I was ready to end my life. I'd pulled the gun out. I'm ready to fire a bullet through the back of my skull. But in that last moment, it was like, okay, God, if you're really there, here's your chance. Give me one reason not to pull the trigger. And it was in that moment he intervened. And yeah, the way he intervened, when you heard the story, it was nothing short of what I would consider a true supernatural intervention that actually stopped me. And in that moment where I was really, truly deep down loathing and hating myself because my marriage had failed, I wasn't man enough to save my marriage. When symptoms of PTSD and anger had come out after watching my son play a video game, and it triggered a flashback that scared me, and to the point that now I'm on edge, and then the stupidest things would set me off to where I'm yelling and screaming at my kids in ways that no father should ever talk to their kids. And then you hate yourself for that. And then, you survive a war, you made it home safe and sound, but one of your troops didn't. And, he died at 23 and left behind a 6-month-old daughter. You start hating yourself for that, and then your marriage officially fails, and you hate yourself for that because you failed God. You couldn't save your marriage. You're a horrible father. And all of these just dark, dark, dark thoughts come into your head. And you talk to yourself with such a very, I would almost call demonic-like self-loathing. I mean, you just tell yourself how bad you suck, and you're really hating yourself for all of this. And it was in that moment when I hit the darkest place, pulled the gun out, put the barrel in my mouth, and basically cussed God out and said, I'm sick and tired of this. If you're really there, give me one reason not to pull the trigger. And of course, he intervened by, giving me the visions of what it would have been like had I pulled the trigger, my kids finding me, my young children growing up without a father, and then the typical things that happen, when fathers aren't around in a kid's life, drugs, alcohol, premarital sex, all the other stuff, and even leaving the legacy of, one of them following in your legacy and killing yourself. When you realize this is what your future will be if you do this, it stops you from doing it. And again, grateful to this day in that moment when God stopped me from committing what would have been a permanent solution to what really was at the time temporary problems, but I couldn't see it. So the biggest part that closed all of that was after realizing that, and I took the gun out of the mouth and I put it away, and I sat there and cried and bawled for a bit because I was tired of the hurt, the anger, the pain, the self-loathing, being in the darkness. It's like, so what's the answer? How do I get over this? And, this is a moment where I had just cussed out the God of the universe, who had every right to, just say, boop, open the door, let me drop into the pits of hell for the way I treated him. And instead, he showed his true loving grace by wrapping his arms around me, letting me know what love really was, and helped me understand that it starts with forgiveness. He had already forgiven me. I needed to forgive myself and let go, and understand that forgiveness is really a selfish gesture. So when the Bible commands us to forgive, the forgiveness isn't for the person who's wronged us benefits or even our own benefit. It's strictly for our benefit, right? The point of it is to let go of the hurt, the anger, the pain. It doesn't stop consequences from actions, whether somebody else did something wrong to you or whether you've even done something wrong and you still may have to atone for it. But it releases all of that emotional baggage that you're carrying that weighs you down in that darkness. And it was in that moment to find that true freedom, the release, to find out of, holy cow, the whole purpose of forgiveness is really for me and to save me and let me go. And in that moment, when God had every right to spite me, and instead he loved on me and showed me that tender, loving grace unlike anything I've ever seen. And since then, of course, from that day on, suicide's never even been a thought or an option in my mind. And it's now more, what can I do to help others who've been in that dark place, who are in that dark place now and understand there is hope and there's a way out. and it is through that grace of God. So ultimately, that's where I'm at and how I'm trying to help others, whether it's transitioning military members to find jobs, whether it was when I was on the ambulance dealing with patients having mental health crisis and suicidal ideation and sharing my story of what I went through a little bit to give them hope and that there's hope. That's how I've gotten to where I am, because that's our purpose. We all have a testimony, and and I've, my suicide attempt was in September 2014. So we're approaching, it's 10 plus, almost 11 years since that event happened. I'm just now finally getting over my shame and guilt for the way I talked to God that way and for what I've done. But I now realize we're losing 22 veterans a day to suicide because they're
Right.
fighting those demons in battles alone and they're losing. So it's time that they need to know that there is hope and you can get by with it. And that's the reason why I'm trying to now come out of my shell. Embarrassment, vulnerable, scared to death, and still feeling very embarrassed and guilty that I talked to God the way I did. But it's not about me. It's about him and his grace and what he did. And if he can do that for me, he can do it for others. And that's the reason why I'm out to help people.
What would you say to someone who's listening and they feel like they're on that precipice? Like, how can we really partner with you and help these individuals? Because I almost feel like the further down you go in that hole, the harder it is to get out, right? Like, there's a point where it would feel like you're just so far down in that hole, you feel like you're never going to be able to get out of it. And when I talk to others about Jesus, I wish I could just impart how I feel about him onto them, and how he makes me feel. Like, I almost feel like they could just kind of step inside my heart and mind and just experience that for themselves. Because same thing, I feel, when I'm sharing my faith or I'm sharing my story, if you've never experienced that before, and if you have been in this just absolutely dark, I think when I was talking to Matt Payne, I was like, it's almost like that Venom character in Spider-Man, where it's just like, it's just coming out of you and it's black and it's crawling all over you and it's just growing and growing. Like, if that's where you sit right now, there's a lot of people like me that's like, how do I, what can I say or what can we do to encourage someone to not allow that just to completely take over? What can we do or say that would maybe peel back the curtain a little bit, even if it's just a beam of light into their life?
Ultimately, it's what we're doing right now by talking about it. I mean, I don't know that, because everybody's situation is so different. And that's
Yeah.
the reason why it's a matter of finding people with testimonies and then connecting them to somebody who's got very, very, very similar experiences that can at least relate and empathize. Because, the Bible is full of all kinds of fantastic wisdom. But if you're not really a believer, you're not going to recognize the authority of the Bible to begin with. So it's got to kind of go back to that personal testimony. One, being humble enough to share it to begin with, kind of like,
Mm.
when I finally stepped out and did that meeting with Matt and Buffy, and then two, stepping out, being on this podcast. I mean, again, the part of me wants to go hide in the closet and keep this shielded and sheltered, because it's
Right.
embarrassing to say I was mentally weak enough that I wanted to end my life. And then I cussed God out and I actually ate the barrel of a gun. I mean, that's embarrassing and just horrific stuff. But at the same time, that's also the devil talking, saying, no, don't let that get out. Why? Because there are people who are in that dark space and they're feeling that
Right.
way. And if somebody has enough courage to step out and say, I was that weak and I'm still here and I'm here by the grace of God, that's what you tell them. And then you tribute the glory back up to God where it belongs, right? That's where it has to go. So, in terms of one any particular thing, just tell your story, tell your testimony. And in the end, if you really read the scripture in the Bible, when it's talking about the good news and the hope that we're trying to share when we witness, you don't have to be a Bible scholar. You don't have to be a graduate from
Right.
seminary and have all of the doctrines and the theology down, because God doesn't necessarily work that way. You look at everybody he's ever used in the Bible, they didn't graduate from seminary and have all these degrees. I'm not knocking the pastors and those that do that and have that
Right.
the academic and the stuff that really helps us understand it. Hush. Sorry. Executive assistants and the guard dogs are
He
over
was
there trying to
agreeing.
warn that somebody's here. So, but anyway, it's about humbling yourself of what did he personally do in your life for you. And then you share that, because what you're sharing when you're doing that is, the ability to point them to the source that is going to save them. And that's pointing them back to God, right? So ultimately you have to make it very personable and just share, what is your story? What is your testimony? How did God impact you in that way? And that shines the light, because what you're ultimately doing is pointing them to the ultimate source of light, right? So that would be my answer in terms of how do you do it? Share your testimony and point them to God. You don't have to be a Bible scholar. You don't have to grab all of the scriptures. I mean, I know enough scriptures, but I'm lousy at quoting chapter and verse, but I can still at least say some of the meaning behind it that points them to God. And that's ultimately what we have to do, right?
Yes. No, while you were talking, I was thinking to myself, he says when we draw him near, he will draw us near. And I love that. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, that is in the Bible. And I couldn't quote where it is to you, but I know that it's there, both literally and figuratively, like he tells us that. And I have felt that when I stay near to him, he is near to me and guides me in ways that, oh gosh, I just can't do anything by myself. I can't do it. I can't. I definitely don't want to let you go without us talking about the story that you shared with me of your alarm clock ringtone when you were deployed, because I love this story and it has stayed with me, and I just keep this in the back of my mind. But for one, all of us 80s babies who grew up in the 90s, we were all secret Nickelback fans, and you couldn't talk about it out loud at high school because we got made fun of. I don't really know why everyone made fun of you if you liked Nickelback, but I did, so I guess come at me. But your ringtone was "If today was your last day," and I again I want to toss it back to you, but you were walking with me through that, and you were sharing like the importance of that being a ringtone, but then you really posed this question of like, what would you do if it was your last day on earth, and mirrored that to what Jesus did with his last day on earth, because everyone knew. I mean, Jesus knew what his last day was. He knew what day he was going to make that ultimate sacrifice, and he knew from day one. So he walked with that for 30 plus years, knowing on this day, this is what is to be. This is what I'm doing. This is why I'm here.
Well, like I said, it almost seems kind of morbid, but at the time when I deployed to Iraq, and I'm a 70s baby. I was born in 70 and still grew up with that, but I'll be the first to admit, I love Nickelback and I don't care. Come at me. I still listen to their music, and
Yes.
it is what it is. So I don't care. I've been in the Nickelback fan club since they really went mainstream and retro. What I like is just good old fashioned rock and roll. But yeah, I had downloaded and set up a ringtone, and of course, when I could try and get sleep, popping melatonin from a Pez dispenser between missions, because I was working nights when most of the ops were going on, and when we were really putting our eyes up, monitoring the situation, idle on target for the guys that were on the ground. Yeah, my alarm clock would go off usually around 12 noon in the afternoon. I'd be lucky if I could get back into my hooch by 6:30, 7 a.m.
Wow.
Try and get me a few hours of sleep. But by 12 o'clock, I would have that alarm go off to wake me up so I could get up, go to the gym, get some exercise PT in, go grab a quick bite to eat, and then get to where I needed to be to get ready for that day's missions, that night's missions, and things like that. But that was my alarm that would go off. It was the main chorus of "If today was your last day." And it was my first deployment into a no kidding combat zone. I'd had multiple deployments, TDY. I deployed for Operation Enduring Freedom everybody else is going to Afghanistan. I deployed to Morone Air Base, Spain, and was helping to run the airfield in Europe. It was a stopover point for like all the fighter jet packages that would have to go in, stop, rest, spend the night, get up next day and fly over. All the heavies that were taking all the equipment back and forth, whether it was tanks and Humvees, whatever, those kind of deals. So my Enduring Freedom tour on my first deployment after 9/11 kicked off, it was pretty easy. I'm in Morone Air Base, Spain. Woohoo, party, right? So then I got deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I'm at this little forward operating locations, appointed the Joint Task Force somewhere north of Baghdad. And yeah, definite hostile zone. And even though, like I said, I spent the majority of my time on the FOB, we were getting shelled and mortared every single day. I mean, multiple times a day. Sometimes you would know it, sometimes you wouldn't. There were a few times they were dangerously close. And I mean, more than enough, you felt the concussion waves, they knocked you down. 90% of the time, you didn't even know it. You know, you only knew that there was an attack because the command post would call up and say, "This is the command post, all clear, all clear." I'm like, I didn't even know we were under attack. Oh, sorry. So you got pretty cavalier with that. But the whole concept of you're in a war zone and you're getting shot at, you know, you'd be driving around the perimeter of the base to get to the other side to get some supplies, and the little Iraqi kids would start throwing rocks at you while they were out there herding, you know, their goats and sheep. Or you could hear shots being fired from the distance and hear the, you know, the bullet flying by going, "Oh, that one was close." And, you know, so you know these things are happening. Any day could be your last day, right? And if you listen to the lyrics of that song, it's like, if today was your last day, what would you do? Mm-hmm. And it hit me, especially when we had our conversation, you know, to get ready for this, because there was a meme I had saw. And of course, most of the time it was talk about, what would you do? Would you go spend money? Would you go crazy? You know, everybody go out, go party, go nuts, do whatever. And it went back and explained, like you said, well, you know, Jesus knew when his last day was. And you know what he did on his last day? He washed feet. He, period, washed, period, feet. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords that came and died for us the day before he died. Did he do anything for his glory? Did he do anything to get ready for the brutal torture and the crucifixion he would endure? No, he washed feet, including the one who would betray him, the one that would leave the table shortly thereafter and for 30 pieces of silver turn him in. That goes back to paint the picture. What are we supposed to be doing and how are we supposed to be living our lives? And at the end of the day, it goes back to summing up the good book. You know, you've got all kinds of good knowledge in this book right here, nice and thick. And at the end of the day, ultimately, 2 rules to live by that come out of that book. Yes, there's 10 commandments, but the 10 commandments are summed up with 2 rules. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple. And at the end of the day, if we can do those 2 things constantly, even if it is our last day, I think we'll be okay.
Yep. Oh, hearing it again. I need that reminder every single day. Every single day.
Well, I caveat, I've got 2 additional steps for me that as far as part of the, we'll call them sub steps of loving my neighbor. So, and part of it is including loving myself. So as apart from obviously loving my neighbor as myself, 2 things I try and do every day. I need to learn something new that I didn't know, and I need to make somebody smile or laugh. And if I can accomplish those 2 things every single day, then no matter what kind of day I've had a successful, good day.
Well, you probably have already accomplished this one today, but you've done number 2 with me. Absolutely.
I'm glad to hear that. And like I said, mission accomplished.
So I don't want to let you go too, Todd, without us talking about the Till Valhalla project. I know you mentioned 22 of our veterans every day take their own life. I'd love
that is
for you
the
to
average
share.
Statistic. Yep, that's the average statistic. 22 veterans a day will be fighting the same demons that I fought and was lucky by the grace of God to win. And again, it wasn't my fighting, it was God's fighting. The Till Valhalla Project is an amazing group. You can go online and follow their stuff. They basically, for sure, they've started off, what they were doing was collecting money, donations, and doing things to build plaques and awards for the family members of those who have died, whether it was in combat, whether it was after combat and fighting the war at home. They started doing things with T-shirt sales, including this T-shirt, which is one of their big ones. I don't know if you can see it, but it's
Yes.
Do not give in to the war within. We need to end veteran suicide. And it's part of the Till Valhalla Project. You can go online, you can go to their website, buy their shirts, buy their stuff, buy the bracelets, and they're really big proponents. So they've gone even beyond now of just, providing memorial plaques for those that have moved on and selling you shirts to help dread the mission. They are raising so much awareness for veterans' mental health, and they're taking money and proceeds to help provide veterans with resources that can help them battle those demons. And, they're doing more to help remove the stigma, but ultimately the stigma's got to start with those of us that we've got to show that it's okay to talk about it. And that regardless of, your status and what you thought you were or how important you are in the military or not important for that matter. Because again, I don't consider myself to be a hero. One of the reasons I've been hesitant to share my story is, I don't feel worthy enough compared to some of the guys I supported, because the missions we were supporting was supporting the Navy SEALs and the Delta and all those guys. But I was just a support guy in the rear with the gear. So when you see what those guys are really doing, who you consider to be the real heroes, again, it gets hard to want to talk about this, because it's like, you're not even a war hero, man. You're just a poser. You're a pogue. You were back at the grunt. You're a grunt back at the base. And people have that stigma that it goes back to something they experienced was traumatizing to them. It's not any less valuable than something that may have happened that's just as traumatizing to the elite warriors that fight it. And I know quite a few of these elite warriors, and they'll be the first to tell you, do not lower yourself as if what you experienced held no value or wasn't just as important, or it wasn't just as scary or shocking to you, because again, it's all about your own personal perception, and it holds just as much value. We have to remove the stigma for veteran mental health. We have to be able to talk about these things and let others know it's okay to talk about it, even if you're just a cook or just a supply guy in the rear of the gear. Because guess what? There is no just a cook or just a supply guy or gal or whatever.
Right.
You signed your name on the dotted line. You raised your hand and you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. You went and left and put yourself willing to go in harm's way, not because you hated what was behind you, but or hated what was in front of you, but because you loved what was behind you and you wanted to protect them. Your willingness to do that puts that stuff as just as much important value. And so many veterans battle those demons because maybe they weren't Navy SEAL or Delta or MARSOC Raider or Marine Recon or, Air Force PJ or Combat Control or whatever. You don't have to be special forces to be affected by things that may or may not have happened in war. We have to include and talk about the women that were involved with it, because so many women get over those war zones, and there's, military sexual trauma and things of that. And that's just as horrific and traumatizing, and they've got just as much of a voice. So again, you don't even have to be a war hero to experience post-traumatic stress. Like you said, you could be here at home and involved in a car accident. You could watch somebody get shot and killed in front of you, even if it was a civilian deal. And post-traumatic stress is your body's reaction. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. It doesn't have to go into a disorder, though. It only becomes a disorder when you don't address the problems and you try and fight that stigma on your own. And we need to let people know it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to reach out. It's okay to get help. And it doesn't make you weak. The problem is people are committing suicide because they've been strong for too long and they're tired. You're not weak by reaching out for help. So anybody that's watching, if you're in that dark area, call 988, hit 1, talk to the Veterans Crisis Line and get on the horn and talk with a veteran who gets there. Because that's something, as a veteran, I can also tell you, part of the thing that's hard sharing with civilians is A lot of civilians don't understand. And it's easier for veterans to even hang out with veterans because we don't even have to tell our stories. That we know they know and they get it, and we can just be. But we've got to make sure that the veterans know that there are options out there for them. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to reach out and get help. And it doesn't make you weak. You're not a poser. You're not a pogue. You served, and your service matters just as much as anybody else's. And if you're fighting demons that are coming after you because of events that did happen, it's okay to talk about it and get help. Ultimately, God will free you from it, but you got to ask for it.
Hmm. Todd, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this. I feel like you're really being God's hands and feet.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for asking me. I really appreciate you.
No, of course. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, or maybe they want to work with you, or maybe they just want to share something and talk with you, what is the best way for them to get in contact?
I would say hit me up on LinkedIn, because I'm on LinkedIn a lot, because that's one of the main resources, of course, I use for the recruiting industry anyway. And my LinkedIn mailbox it's always there and it's always open. So if they want to reach out and have a chat and say, hey, I heard the podcast, you have a minute to talk? Sure, I'll find a minute. I may not have all the answers and I may not be the professional, but I definitely know some people I can refer you to including our own friends, Matt and Buffy, whose Outer Circle Foundation, they're there to provide a lot of this type of support as well. So I don't have the answers. I know some people that do, and I can definitely refer you. So best way to find me, hit me up on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Todd, this was great. I really appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate you having me and being patient and dealing with me. And I thank you again so much.